Welcome to LGIU's Fireside Chats, our new interview series from the Future Local Lab. In this series, we will be joined by guests from around the world to discuss what the future holds for local government, with the emphasis firmly on what the sector could do now to start preparing for that future. I'm Dr. Greg Stride, Principal Researcher at LGIU. Today, we're sitting down with Mekhala Krishnamurthy. Mekhala is an Associate Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at Ashoka University, India. Over the past 20 years, Mekhala's research, public policy, and professional engagement have involved work on a range of subjects, including public health, agriculture, and regional and local economies. She has served as the Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, where she built and directed the State Capacity Initiative, a major interdisciplinary research and practice program committed to addressing the challenges and possibilities of building state capacity in democratic and federal India. We are very excited to welcome Mekhala to the Future Local Lab and have the opportunity to dive into her insights on local government and its relationship with citizens. Before we get started on the discussion, could we take a second to talk a bit about your career journey, please? Where did your interest in public policy and government come from, and how did your career begin?
Hi, Greg. It's really such a pleasure to meet and to have a chance to talk to you. It's also been really a privilege to be part of this group that LGIU recognized. And just to say that every time it gets mentioned, nobody ever likes to talk too much about being part of any list, I think, beyond a point. But it was really exciting because I think everyone realized how distinctive it was in terms of not just the number of women, but how many locally embedded innovators were part of the group. I think that's very exciting because we're usually part of a common tribe. And I think what you realize when you look at local government is that there's so much diversity in terms of the kinds of people who believe in local government. So I'll just start with a little thank you for including me in that wonderful, wonderful group. So, as my career, I was thinking about this, particularly because we are talking about local government. And if I think back to high school and early college, which is when I would have started cultivating these interests, I think I might have thought I was going to work much more in global institutions, in looking at sort of large-scale multilateral organizations. I think we were looking in the 1990s at a time where there was so much war, there was so much conflict. As a young student, I think I invested a lot in the idea that the UN could actually solve things. And I thought I would study international economics and international relations. And I mean, with all respect to those disciplines and to colleagues of mine who work in them, as I got into university, I realized this was all very theoretical and slightly even boring in its theory, not just theoretical, but even not persuasive. Found myself actually engaging much more with the ways in which all these huge global issues are really local, right? Because ultimately they only manifest locally and they only make sense locally and regionally and nationally. And so I found myself actually more and more drawn into disciplines like sociology and anthropology, even into social history. And that's interesting to me. I think the local as a concept is actually hugely universal. And it suffers from the problem that people think it is actually localized because of the term local. So when we say I work on universal concepts, people just assume that you're working on some large scale, big, relevant concept. And when you're working on the local, you're somehow grounded in some local. But the idea of local, including local government, most of all, it is the ultimate, I think, universal concept, but somehow gets this sort of challenge of people seeing that. So I think that's quite interesting because to me, I was drawn to the local because none of the global issues I wanted to work on made sense except in local context. And then very specifically, I discovered local government and its importance when, as a fourth year in college, I had a little grant to go and study women's courts in Gujarat, which is a state in India. And these were local courts, informal local justice institutions that were created by poor rural women because of the problems with the mainstream judicial system, particularly for violence against women, local divorce cases, and things like that. And it had been set up by a government organization, but had then flourished into these independent, women's groups, which used to, they took support from the state and they worked with the community, right? And so they were these organizations that quintessentially sort of shuttled between state and community to make things work. And they worked a lot with the local police and these kinds of organizations. And so I was thrown into the world of thinking about local organizations through their work and their very interesting relationship being in government and outside government and moving in between the two. And then I ended up working on the everyday life of Bombay policemen. I grew up in Mumbai, and the police in that city have a very famous reputation in Bollywood films, and they're quite a caricatured group. And I got very interested in the popular representations in the personal lives of police. That was the second sort of way in which I was studying this. And I found a whole bunch of policemen in the city who write poetry, and they have actually policeman poetry circles. And a whole different set of contradictions emerged about these frontline workers who are in uniform and are meant to safeguard the streets and law and order, but often buy substitute pairs of their uniform from illegal street hawkers because the state gives them only 1 or 2 pairs of uniforms and they run out, and then who provisions them is local illegal vendors. And the policeman would say, now the joke is we're going to go wear the uniform and then shoo them off the street, but we wouldn't have the spare uniform if they didn't come and provide it to us. So these contradictions were, just bubbling all over the place. And I was sort of realizing that this is so important that we understand these dynamics better. Then I worked on public health for a few years, and my doctoral work was on local markets, agricultural markets in central India. And there I was looking at frontline regulators. And so over the years, I think just through that first work, I've just followed the lives and careers and contributions and contradictions of frontline workers. And all then through them, seeing the complexity of the state and the community interactions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, seeing the global in the very local and even the very individual, I think that's something that we can really identify with. And that's actually what I want to ask about next, is that lots of your work, as you've referenced there, has been based in India, where you're based. And I was wondering, what do you see as being specific about the local in India? And what do you see as being more globally applicable about your research in India?
I mean, it's so interesting. I think, again, the same problem. So as anthropologists, one of the ways we address this is by saying, when you study anything fully, you know the parts that can travel and the parts that are grounded. So I think in any good story, no matter how local, and in fact, the more local and the more grounded and the more complete you are in contextualization, the more comprehensive you can be. And that comprehensiveness can travel. Right? Certain elements will travel and certain elements won't. And I think with India, one of the great things, I mean, it's a huge country and it's an old country. And so we end up having a lot of conversation as people who work on India and as Indian citizens about exceptionalism. We actually don't feel like we need to often look at the whole world too much, right? Because we're so diverse and we're so complex. This is one of the biggest problems of taking lessons anywhere in India. The big joke, and all of you working with bureaucrats will completely relate to this, but whenever we go and take an idea from another place to a different context in India, like from one state to another, they'll be like, it won't work. What worked in Madhya Pradesh will not work in Punjab. Why are you telling me about this place? This is not my context, right? And so we get this a lot. For those of us who work with government, the big secret is that we always let government think it's their idea, right? Because everybody has to come to it themselves. So I think ownership is really important. And in that sense, like in India, like anywhere else, believes its problems to be very unique. But I think more of it can travel and more of it can be cross-fertilized and we can learn. I think where there is specific challenge, the diversity is enormous. The size of the population is remarkable. It is the world's largest democracy. So there's federalism and, local government and, a really complex dynamic of federalism and decentralization in a country like India, which is a union of states. And so that those histories of federalism are quite unique. They're very different and comparative to federalism as it has emerged, and the questions of the decentralization have emerged, say, in the United Kingdom or in the United States, which is another federal democracy, or in other parts of the world. Then I think the fact that we are still, from an employment perspective, enormously dependent on the agriculture and on agricultural, right? Like to the point where an aggregate on average, you're still looking at 40% employed in agriculture, which is not the great structural transformation story that was supposed to happen, but that we're endlessly frustrated also about. But that is the reality. Agriculture is still central to the majority of Indian lives and is still vastly an informal economy. This is something that, again, it's like the informal economy is everywhere, but the scale of the informal economy in India is very distinctive. And then, of course, like in every country has its own ways of thinking about class and hierarchy and experiencing those. So political economy, caste, gender in each state has different complexities, and some are matrilineal. We have patrilineal systems, land laws. So there's lots. And then we share with countries that have had colonial legacies, long histories of colonialism, and then post-colonial transition. So there are many things that relate to other places, not everything everywhere, but more than, both travels from other countries. I've been very inspired by comparative work, but also I think from our own learnings, there's often more that travels. A person in a market, this local market that I worked in when I was hunting for a grain market, like a market to sit in, and I was hopping around, and he said, well, they're very much like people, you share DNA. All the markets are actually very, very, very similar, but they all have dramatically different personalities. Sometimes you don't really believe that they belong to the same species. And I always felt like for the first 6 months that I did research, when I picked them, I thought, okay, they're all quite similar. Then when I did research for 6 months, I was like, there's no place on earth like this place that I'm in. And this is so particular. And then about 18 months into it, I kind of knew the ways in which it was general and the ways in which it was particular. And so that's how I think of all research anywhere, but also research in India.
Yeah, and I think that ability to take different perspectives, to zoom in and zoom out, is really what makes local work so interesting, is that you can look across the globe, or you can focus on your neighbor and you'll get such a different story. And that's so fascinating about your research and the research more generally of the people in our list. Yeah, so to focus on a specific project that you've been working on, I'd be interested to hear more, because I mentioned it earlier and I think some of our listeners will have wondered, what does that mean? About the State Capacity Initiative. What is state capacity and what work have you been doing on it?
I mean, it's a great question, and there's a lot of academic discussion about, is it state capacity? Is it state capability? And what's the difference between state capacity and state capability? How is it different from, say, thinking about it as public administration? And then there are very different views. Like, one is state capacity is a state's ability to carry out what its own goals are, right? Does the state have the capacity to do that? But then we know states are complex and, in a larger sense, also quite capable of great violence. Yes, legitimate violence, but also that. And that state projects may not be inclusive at any given point. So for us at the State Capacity Initiative, we didn't want to think of capacity as just something technical. Can you raise enough revenue? Can you deliver enough services? But actually to be organizational, to think about what are the kinds of arrangements of money, human resources, organizations, and organizational relationships and networks, and what kind of relationships and participation do you need from citizens to actually make state capacity something which is normative as well as technical, right? So I think for us, that's why it's about democratic and federal India. It's not about just building state capacity anywhere or in any way, but in keeping those principles, whether they're constitutional, whether they're questions of what does it mean to be inclusive, what does it mean to be, a country which actually believes in federalism and democracy, and then to design our institutions, right? Particularly in India, because of the size and scale, we have a tendency, or we always hear this, what India needs is a benevolent dictator. We want that order, this idea that India is too messy, that democracy is too noisy. And it's very difficult to be efficient, right, in that context. And for us, state capacity isn't about efficiency alone. It's about government that understands its role and purpose and then builds institutions, organizations, systems, relationships, and nurtures those that make that possible, right? And so sometimes that's not the most efficient answer. But in terms of concrete work, we focused a lot of our work on what we call the people of the state. So usually we think of government employees or we think about citizens as the people of the country. But the people of the state are those who are government employees, both permanent, temporary, and contracted. And we wanted to understand, the people, the organizations, and then the relationships with citizens, the relationship of state and society. So this was what the initiative was broadly about. We did, a lot of work with civil servants, unlike in the United Kingdom, for example, where civil servants are interviewed. India has higher civil services, the Indian Administrative Service, but actually is not often interviewed. And one of the first things we did in the initiative was actually do a very interesting survey during COVID in 2 rounds of the higher civil services to actually understand norms and values. So for us, state capacity didn't start with, do you have enough revenue? Can you just the fiscal arrangements, although the fiscal arrangements are critical, but also began with questions of norms, values, organizational purpose, and then a set of critical questions around, say, regulation, regulatory design and capacity. We used to run a program called Know Your Regulator because like in India, like everywhere else, everybody's all about know your customer and banking regulations. But we were like, do you know your regulators? Do you know, who they are and how they're structured, and the regulatory agencies? But also, do the regulators know themselves? Like often one of the interesting things is that regulatory organizations often decenter core public purpose. If you ask them what they do, they tell you a lot of what they do. Though why do you do what you do, which is the actual core purpose around which you build it, sometimes gets decentered. So we were returning to some of those questions. We worked a lot on regulatory design and capacity, on federalism and its institutions, so federalism and decentralization and those dynamics. Most of it, when you think about it in formal language, sounds very dry because people are like, this is the dreaded word, administrative reforms. But, these are really at the heart of making government, purposeful and accountable and effective. So this was the kind of work that we were doing, working with researchers across different fields, from lawyers and engineers and anthropologists, sociologists, economists, political scientists, geographers, and then also working with bureaucrats in different states, some retired, some in service, working at different levels to kind of illuminate these dynamics, and then working with civil society and public organizations, but, and associations.
Yeah. A couple of questions that really popped up in my head from that. The first one would be, are there any examples that really stick with you from your research of the state capacity? Anybody you spoke to that really stays with you? And the second one, and I really like asking this about any research, is there anything that really surprised you?
Just when we're thinking about these conversations about why it's so hard to make things visible, one of the regulators said, you only notice regulators when things break down. And you think we're very non-dynamic. But to be a regulator, to keep things going requires remarkable dynamism. And that's actually when we're dynamic. I think a lot of what we don't notice about government work, right? And I think in terms of some of the survey results were really interesting, right? Because there was actually a interesting split. There were about 50% of the Indian Administrative Service was confused on whether they believed that, no, not confused, but they had differences of opinion on whether you should plan or react, right? And everybody said planning is better, but then when it came to like what actually worked, it was reaction. Similarly, there was this really interesting tension between those who felt it was public cooperation that really helped in COVID versus fear of coercion. And I don't think we expected 50%, like 45, 55, like that kind of divergence. At the same time, when you asked them about if you have a problem, should you be able to reassign your work, it was very service driven, right? Like the overwhelming majority said you had to show up to work. Right? There was no question of in a pandemic having vulnerabilities or anything else. You are a government servant, you show up to work. And I don't think any of the officers, nobody was surprised. So there was a huge amount of service motivation, which again, I think people underestimate how much people do think in those terms. But when it came to core things like planning versus reaction, coordination and cooperation versus coercion, to me, if 50% have a difference of opinion on which one is actually making the difference, how do you design and work with government, with people? What's been most interesting is when we present this material to them, or we make a room full of officers take the same test and then, or the survey, and then we share the results immediately. I think they're quite surprised that the norms and values aren't quite as shared. And I think it raises a really interesting question about what kinds of areas do you want diversity in? And there's lots of conversation today in light of what's happening in the United States on perspectival diversity, like diversity of perspectives is really important. But how much do you need to share core values, and what are shared core values when you're looking at questions of, faith in the public or how you relate to the public or other things like that? So this was quite interesting and surprising. I think we have lots of examples of surprisingly effective innovation at various points in time. But whether they last and how long they last, and whether we build institutions that can actually work over time and how to maintain, that's always a question.
That's really interesting. I think what you were just saying there about these shared values, and particularly about one thing that we think about a lot is the sort of shared missions where we have these things that we're all driving towards. And a couple of those that spring to mind immediately are the reaction to climate change and the sort of changing economies. And I was just wondering if in any of your work that you ever look at anything to do with the challenges to future economies and sustainability, or anything along those lines. Are these like big challenges that hit everybody or are going to hit everybody, but in different ways? Is that anything that you've looked at in your work?
I think the pandemic was a very interesting moment. So many people did reflect on this. The role of the state itself, and I think there's really interesting work about this in general. It immediately springs to mind in the US context, Michael Lewis's fifth risk. The fifth risk is losing what you didn't know could save you. And I think government is full of that. What's been very interesting in our work is looking at what does it mean to build up that type of capacity. And, we've seen this in the work of Mariana Mazzucato, but also I was saying Michael Lewis, this idea that government actually takes risks, but also does things that others don't do. So I think actually many routine functions of government are precisely the functions that kick into action during a crisis. And a person I do very close work on public health often talks about this, Dr. Sundaraman, about if you can't take care of one house when it falls in disaster management, how are you going to do it when all of the houses are falling at the same time? And so for government, actually, efficient working isn't 100%. When you're working in government, you actually don't want organizations all working at 100%, but they have to work at 70, 80% efficiency so that they have that inbuilt surge capacity when they have to respond to crisis. So in our work, some of the thinking about crisis, and we've seen in Odisha state in India, which was very bad with cyclones and disaster relief, remarkable improvements in disaster planning and emergency response. So I think for me, a lot of the thinking that's happening now on what does it mean to be efficient, efficiency thinking has to have a very different kind of understanding when you're dealing with crisis, because actually you need to have give. You need to have capacity to ramp up at a certain point. So yeah, there is some very interesting thinking that is, I think, happening now in India about how does one think about these questions and build your everyday capacity. It's very funny because when people say mission in the UK, I think they mean purpose, or like we all get together and work in a mission mode. As a person who works on state capacity in India, I get very worried with mission mode. Like I like to think about everyday work because I find it very unsettling to talk about mission-driven everything, because actually then you have this simulated pushing everything together to solve the problem. But that's not how daily life and interconnections work. Things are much more embedded, much more local. And I actually think the quotidian has to work well for us to be able to respond really well in crisis and plan for crisis, because you have much greater visibility on how things are involved, but we find it very difficult to generate energy around the quotidian, the everyday, the stable, and so we want missions. And so I get very nervous. I love the thinking around belief in government and pushing for public value. But sitting in India, I almost feel we do too much missions. We do vertical programs well rather than comprehensive programs. We do precisely because we don't decentralize. I think that's an interesting tension, that do we need more missions to deal with crisis, or do we need a better everyday capacity?
Yeah, and I can definitely see it in all the work that we do here, the sort of the tension between the everyday and the purposeful. Yeah, yeah, very, very interesting. I wanted to ask you, you touched on a couple there. You mentioned climate change. I was just wondering, looking to the sort of future, if we look over the next 40, 50, 60 years, what other challenges do you see that it's likely that the sort of state and the local state will have to take on? And do you have any reflections on how it might be likely to respond to those challenges?
Yeah. So I think there are two things that I think are very interesting. One is the problem of local economies. And I was telling you right at the beginning that India is a very informal economy, and we're small scale, large number of small producers, small consumers, and small intermediaries. One of the really important challenges for our thinking on government and thinking of public purpose is going to be, how do we approach the economy? Do we think about the economy as something that has to be managed at the monetary and managed at that level and then left to markets, largely deregulated? Or do we actually believe the government is not just a regulator coming in for market failures, but actually has to multiply value, right, and give people the opportunities? I mention this because in a country like India, agriculture is often thought of as a welfare sector, but it is the largest employment generator. And I think across the world, we are having a really significant challenge. Jim Ferguson's very interesting work on the politics of distribution, it's called Give a Man a Fish, is very interesting. And I teach a class on the welfare state where we actually start by reading these two different texts. The first is the history of the making of the welfare state in Britain, which is Chris Renwick's Bread for All. And then we move to the 21st century and to Ferguson, which is Give a Man a Fish, right? And we're asking this question, how did we go from Bread for All, which was about workers, employment, contributory welfare, to Give a Man a Fish, which is actually about cash transfers and distribution? And I think it's got to do with whether we believe people will actually have jobs, right? So for example, it's like, you can't teach a man to fish if there are no jobs being produced in the economy. And this is a pre-AI story. India has had something we've called jobless growth for a long time because we started moving and building and gaining from services. Manufacturing didn't grow in the way that we had anticipated, and there are many, many complex reasons for that. And then agriculture still remains vital. Agriculture is this great sponge, but also it's not giving people incomes. And I think for local economies, local government, and for government at all scales, how we're going to approach this. And I think the cash transfer story has a very particular challenge for local government, because cash transfers are now moving directly from central accounts of government to people. Earlier, a lot of this was actually mediated by local government. This is the great moment where we are thinking a lot about disintermediation, taking middlemen out of the scene, but actually middlemen do very important roles. Economies collapse when you remove too many middlemen without understanding their role. They're also deeply invested in local politics and local societies and local economies. So that's a challenge. Again, here, of course, you don't want brokers and you don't want people having been dominated and taken, their job cards being taken, all of that, understood. But at the same time, you can't keep bypassing the local government and deliberative systems because you can reach people now directly. And I think one of the most interesting challenges, I think climate is a huge challenge. All of these are going to be like massive challenges. But I think the bigger challenge is how we view this dynamic of disintermediation and diversification in our societies and our economies and in our governments. How do we realize what we are going to lose if we don't actually have some collective structures for problem solving? And a lot of my new work with colleagues Rahul Sharma and Dan Honig are on relational capacities, on how do you build and recenter relationships and really build up the stock of what we're calling relational state capacity, which is what happens every time a state agent and a citizen look at each other with mutual recognition of their humanness. So I think, to me, this is actually the bigger challenge. And I think how we handle technical challenges will be critical, whether those are questions of technology and AI or questions of new public health techniques and vaccinations or climate. The technical and the administrative will have to be thought through much more creatively. But I think if we disintermediate too much, too fast, too soon, I think that's the challenge that local governments are going to really, really face.
And what advice would you give those local leaders that are going to be facing this challenge?
Yeah, so I think the hardest thing is making your value clear. Government is not good at making its own value clear where it really matters. It's good at showing brute strength, power, all the things. Only government can do it at scale, etc. But I think local government, its ability to communicate what it actually does well. It's like the person who said, you only notice me when things break down. You can't support something you only notice when it breaks down. This is what the private sector does very well. It advertises itself, and it's not just advertising and marketing, but its ability to convince people of a narrative, right? I recently had a conversation with people in government in a state, and they thought the private enterprise that was doing health service delivery was doing a great job. And they thought they were just doing doorstep delivery of drugs, where that place was closing down at 5 o'clock in the evening. But somehow in our minds, we had already assumed they were doing doorstep delivery. And the one qualified doctor who visited that private entity was the government doctor who went on the Saturday to this private clinic to help them out and got an additional income for that. But it was the government actually providing this person. But the narrative was completely different, some distance away, in terms of what was actually working. And I think government really struggles to make its value apparent. And I think it's not just about being on social media and being part of the buzz of it, and maybe part of it too. I do think communication is a huge part. But it is more substantive than that. And to me, that is like the single biggest challenge we face is the persuasion, that we have to be able to persuade people before it's too late.
I think that's an excellent place to leave it. So thank you so much for sharing your experience and expertise with us today. And thank you to everybody for listening. We'll be back soon with more expert interviews for the Future Local Lab.